The bright pink tactical backpack stood out like a beacon among the sea of military olive and desert tan gear sprawled across the equipment inspection table. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez couldn't help but snicker as he picked up the offending item, holding it at arm's length as if it might contaminate his camouflage uniform. "What is this supposed to be, Barbie's bug-out bag?" he called across the staging area, his voice carrying enough volume to draw attention from the dozen other soldiers preparing for the joint training exercise. The laughter that followed was immediate and harsh, echoing off the concrete walls of the Fort Bragg equipment bay. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Lieutenant Emma Chen didn't look up from organizing her survival kit, her weathered hands continuing their methodical inventory of items with practiced precision. She had expected this reaction, had prepared for it even. The bright pink gear that Rodriguez was now examining like a foreign artifact had been carefully selected for reasons that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with a survival philosophy that most of her colleagues wouldn't understand until it was too late. "You planning to signal rescue helicopters with that thing?" continued another voice from across the room. Sergeant Jake Morrison, a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks, was examining Emma's pink emergency whistle with exaggerated curiosity. "Or maybe you're hoping the enemy will be too distracted by the color to shoot straight." The comments multiplied as more soldiers discovered Emma's unconventional gear choices. Pink paracord neatly coiled in waterproof containers. A rose-colored emergency blanket folded with military precision. Even her water purification tablets came in bright pink packaging that she had deliberately chosen over standard military issue. "I've been in the Army for 15 years, Rodriguez announced to the gathering crowd, "and I've never seen anything like this. Chun, did you raid a toy store for your survival gear?" Emma finally looked up, her dark eyes meeting Rodriguez's with calm confidence. At 32, she had learned to navigate these situations with the same strategic thinking that had earned her a place in the Army's elite survival training program. Her slight frame and quiet demeanor often led people to underestimate her, a misconception she had stopped trying to correct years ago. "The gear is fully functional and meets all specifications," she said simply, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to defending her choices. "Color doesn't affect performance." This response only fueled more laughter and commentary from the assembled soldiers. Morrison held up her pink compass, turning it over in his massive hands like he was examining an alien artifact. "Functional? Sure," he said with a grin. "But what happens when we're trying to blend in with the environment and you're carrying around a collection of gear that looks like it belongs at a little girl's tea party?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The question struck at the heart of a debate that had been following Emma throughout her military career. Her approach to survival gear challenged conventional wisdom about camouflage and blending in, representing a philosophy that prioritized psychological warfare and strategic misdirection over traditional concealment techniques. Emma had developed her theories during her time as a survival instructor at the Army's Combat Survival School, where she had observed hundreds of soldiers navigate hostile environments with varying degrees of success. The ones who survived longest, she had noticed, weren't always the strongest or best equipped in conventional terms. They were the ones who could think differently, who could turn perceived weaknesses into unexpected advantages. The idea for her pink gear collection had emerged during a particularly challenging training exercise in the mountains of Colorado. Emma had been tasked with evading capture for 7 days, while a team of experienced trackers hunted her through terrain that offered little natural concealment. Traditional camouflage had proven useless against thermal imaging and sophisticated tracking techniques, forcing her to rely on psychological tactics and strategic misdirection. During that exercise, she had observed how certain colors and unexpected visual elements could create cognitive dissonance in pursuers, causing them to second-guess their assumptions and waste precious time processing contradictory information. A bright pink item glimpsed through trees didn't register as potential military equipment in most minds. It registered as civilian debris, as something dropped by a lost hiker or discarded by careless campers. The theory had proven itself during her most challenging survival test, when she had successfully evaded capture for the full 7 days, while her traditionally equipped counterparts had been caught within 48 hours. But explaining this concept to her colleagues had proven nearly impossible, especially when the explanation required challenging deeply held beliefs about military effectiveness and masculine identity. "You know what's going to happen out there," Rodriguez continued, warming to his theme as more soldiers gathered around Emma's gear table. "The first time we make contact with opposing forces, Chun's going to light up like a Christmas tree. Enemy spotters are going to see that pink gear from miles away." Emma continued organizing her equipment, each item placed with deliberate precision in her pack. Her pink gear wasn't a random collection of unconventional choices. It was a carefully curated system designed around specific survival scenarios that most soldiers never considered. Each piece served multiple purposes, with redundant functions built into what appeared to be a collection of whimsical accessories. The pink paracord, for instance, was actually a specialized high-visibility variant designed for emergency signaling and marking. In survival situations, being seen by rescue teams often mattered more than hiding from potential threats. The bright color could serve as trail markers visible from aircraft, as emergency signals that stood out against natural backgrounds, or as psychological warfare against pursuers who would dismiss obvious pink objects as non-threatening civilian debris. Her pink emergency blanket utilized advanced materials that provided superior insulation while doubling as a psychological deterrent. The color's association with non-military contexts could cause hostile forces to hesitate before engaging what they perceived as civilian equipment, buying precious seconds in critical situations. The same principle applied to her pink water containers, medical supplies, and communication equipment. "I heard Chun actually requested this stuff specially," added Corporal Davis, a younger soldier eager to join the ridicule. "Went out of her way to find pink versions of standard gear." "What's next? Bedazzled body armor?" The laughter that followed was louder this time, with several soldiers pulling out phones to document Emma's unconventional equipment choices. She recognized the familiar pattern of military humor that often masked deeper anxieties about difference and change. Her pink gear challenged fundamental assumptions about what military effectiveness looked like, threatening carefully constructed identities built around traditional masculine imagery. Emma had encountered this resistance throughout her career, from basic training instructors who questioned her commitment to fellow officers, who suggested she might be better suited for administrative roles. The criticism had intensified as she advanced through specialized training programs, culminating in her selection for the Army's most elite survival instruction positions, despite vocal opposition from traditionalists who believed her approach undermined military standards. The upcoming training exercise represented a crucial test of her theories under realistic conditions. Operation Phantom Valley would simulate 30 days of survival and evasion in hostile territory, with experienced opposing forces attempting to track and capture participating soldiers. Success would be measured not just by avoiding capture, but by completing specific mission objectives while maintaining operational security in a contested environment. Emma's pink gear would face its ultimate test in terrain that offered minimal natural concealment and against opponents specifically trained to exploit traditional camouflage patterns. The exercise parameters deliberately favored unconventional thinking and adaptive strategies over brute force approaches, making it an ideal proving ground for her survival philosophy. "You know what I think?" Rodriguez said, his voice taking on a more serious tone as he continued examining Emma's equipment. "I think someone's been watching too many spy movies and confusing fiction with reality. This isn't some Hollywood production where the quirky character wins through creative thinking. This is military training designed to prepare us for real combat situations." His comment touched on a fundamental misunderstanding of Emma's approach. Her strategies weren't based on movie fantasies or wishful thinking, they were grounded in careful analysis of actual survival scenarios and documented psychological research. She had studied countless after-action reports from soldiers who had successfully evaded capture, identifying patterns and strategies that contradicted conventional military wisdom. The most successful evaders she had discovered weren't necessarily the ones with the best traditional training or equipment. They were the ones who could adapt quickly to unexpected situations, who could exploit their opponent's assumptions and blind spots, and who could turn apparent disadvantages into strategic advantages. Pink gear wasn't a gimmick, it was a tool for exploiting cognitive biases and creating tactical opportunities. Emma finished organizing her pack and stood, shouldering the bright pink backpack that had started the morning's controversy. Around her, soldiers continued their preparations with gear that looked virtually identical standard issue equipment in regulation colors that announced their military purpose to anyone within visual range. "Laugh all you want," she said quietly, her voice carrying enough authority to cut through the ambient noise of preparation. "But remember this moment when you're sitting in a prisoner compound wondering how you got caught so quickly." The comment created a moment of uncomfortable silence as soldiers processed the implications of her words. Emma's quiet confidence suggested knowledge and experience that went beyond theoretical training, hinting at real-world applications that most of them had never considered. Morrison broke the tension with forced laughter, waving Emma's pink compass in the air like a trophy. "Big talk from someone carrying around toys," he said, though his voice lacked the certainty it had carried earlier. "We'll see how tough you are when the exercise starts and you're stuck with gear that makes you look like a lost college student." Emma smiled slightly, the expression containing more knowledge than smugness. She had heard variations of this prediction throughout her career, always from soldiers who confused appearance with capability and who couldn't imagine how traditional assumptions might be turned against traditional approaches. The truth was that looking like a lost college student might be exactly the advantage she needed. Enemy forces trained to identify military threats often struggled to process contradictory visual information, especially when it challenged their fundamental expectations about what dangerous opponents looked like. A small woman with pink gear didn't register as a high-priority threat in most tactical assessments, allowing her to operate beneath the threshold of serious attention until it was too late for effective countermeasures. As the morning progressed and soldiers finished their equipment preparations, Emma found herself increasingly isolated from the group conversations and informal briefings that typically preceded major training exercises. Her pink gear had marked her as an outsider, someone whose judgment and competence were suspect despite her official qualifications and training record. The isolation wasn't entirely unwelcome. Emma had learned to use these periods of social exclusion for final mental preparation, reviewing her strategies and contingencies without the distraction of group dynamics and peer pressure. She preferred to enter challenging situations with a clear head and focused intentions, rather than the false confidence that often emerged from group reassurance and mutual back-slapping. Her approach to the upcoming exercise differed fundamentally from her colleagues' strategies. While they focused on physical conditioning, weapons maintenance, and traditional evasion techniques, Emma concentrated on psychological preparation and adaptive thinking. She visualized multiple scenarios and response options, considering how her unconventional gear might create opportunities that wouldn't be available to traditionally equipped soldiers. The pink gear represented more than just equipment choices. It embodied a completely different philosophy about survival in hostile environments. Instead of trying to become invisible, Emma planned to hide in plain sight. Instead of avoiding detection, she would court detection while controlling how she was perceived and categorized by potential threats. As the final briefings concluded and soldiers began moving toward transport vehicles, Emma noticed several officers examining her equipment with expressions that ranged from confusion to concern. Colonel Patricia Hayes, the exercise commander, approached with the measured stride of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions under pressure. "Lieutenant Chen," she said, her voice carrying the neutral tone that military officers use when addressing potentially problematic situations. "I've been reviewing your equipment manifest, and I have some concerns about your gear choices for this exercise." Emma came to attention, her posture reflecting years of military discipline despite the unconventional backpack she carried. "Ma'am, all equipment meets or exceeds required specifications. I'm prepared to provide documentation for any items you'd like to review." Colonel Hayes glanced at the pink backpack, her expression revealing nothing about her personal opinions. "The concern isn't about specifications, Lieutenant. It's about the potential impact on unit cohesion and mission effectiveness. Your gear choices are creating distraction and commentary that could affect group dynamics during the exercise." The statement highlighted one of the central challenges Emma faced throughout her career. Her effectiveness as an individual soldier often came at the cost of group harmony, creating tensions between personal performance and unit cohesion that military leadership struggled to resolve. Her unconventional approaches challenged group norms in ways that could either strengthen or weaken overall unit effectiveness, depending on how the challenges were managed. "I understand the concern, ma'am," Emma replied carefully. "However, I believe the exercise parameters favor individual innovation and adaptive thinking. My gear choices are designed to test specific survival strategies under realistic conditions." Colonel Hayes studied Emma for a long moment, weighing competing priorities and potential outcomes. The exercise had been designed to push participants beyond their comfort zones and test their ability to succeed in unconventional scenarios. Emma's approach aligned with those objectives, even if it created interpersonal complications that made leadership more difficult. "Very well, Lieutenant," she said finally. "But understand that your gear choices have made you a focal point for this exercise. Every soldier here will be watching to see whether your theories hold up under pressure. Success or failure won't just reflect on you. It will influence how the Army approaches survival training for years to come." The weight of that responsibility settled on Emma's shoulders like a familiar burden. She had carried similar expectations throughout her career, always aware that her failures would be seen as proof that unconventional approaches didn't work, while her successes would be dismissed as lucky exceptions to established rules. As soldiers boarded transport vehicles for the journey to the exercise area, Emma found herself sitting alone in the back of a truck while her colleagues clustered in animated conversation about their strategies and expectations. The physical separation mirrored the philosophical distance between her approach and theirs, creating a natural experiment in competing survival philosophies. The truck rumbled through the North Carolina countryside toward terrain that would test every assumption about military effectiveness and survival strategy. Behind them, Fort Bragg disappeared into the distance, taking with it the familiar certainties of base life and regulation equipment. Ahead lay 30 days of survival simulation that would either validate Emma's unconventional theories or expose them as dangerous fantasy. Emma checked her pink gear one final time, each item representing months of research and testing. The bright colors that had drawn so much ridicule were about to face their ultimate test in an environment where the difference between success and failure could determine not just individual careers, but the future direction of military survival. Training. The mockery would continue, she knew, until the moment when her pink gear either saved her life or got her captured. Everything else was just noise, the inevitable resistance that accompanied any challenge to established ways of thinking. In a few hours, the only thing that would matter would be results. As the convoy approached the drop zone, where soldiers would begin their individual survival journeys, Emma felt the familiar calm that preceded her most challenging missions. She had prepared for this moment throughout her career, developing theories and strategies that contradicted conventional wisdom about survival in hostile territory. Soon, the talking would stop and the testing would begin. Her pink gear would either prove itself in the crucible of realistic simulation, or it would join the long list of military innovations that had failed when subjected to practical application. Either way, Emma was ready to discover which of her critics had been right about the relationship between appearance and effectiveness in survival situations. The morning mist clung to the Appalachian ridgelines like smoke from distant battles. As Emma crouched behind a fallen oak tree, studying the enemy patrol through her pink-framed binoculars. Day 18 of Operation Phantom Valley, and she was the only participant still evading capture while completing mission objectives that had stumped soldiers with decades more experience. The irony wasn't lost on her as she watched Staff Sergeant Rodriguez being escorted toward a prisoner collection point, his regulation olive drab gear having failed to provide the concealment he'd counted on. He'd been captured on day 3, along with most of the other soldiers who had mocked her equipment choices at the staging area. Morrison had lasted until day 7 before thermal imaging spotted his traditional camouflage through the forest canopy. Emma's pink backpack lay beside her, its bright color deliberately visible to the patrol moving through the valley below. She had positioned herself where the morning sun would reflect off the pack's surface, creating exactly the kind of obvious signature that conventional military thinking said would guarantee immediate detection and capture. The patrol leader raised his binoculars, scanning the hillside where Emma waited with practiced patience. She watched him pause as the pink reflection caught his attention, studying the anomaly through his optics for nearly 30 seconds. Then, just as Emma had predicted based on extensive psychological research, he lowered the binoculars and continued his patrol route without investigating further. The bright pink object didn't register as a threat in his tactical assessment. It looked like civilian debris perhaps, a backpack dropped by weekend hikers or camping gear abandoned by recreational visitors to the national forest. Enemy forces trained to identify military threats struggled to process contradictory visual information that challenged their fundamental expectations about what dangerous opponents looked like. Emma smiled as the patrol disappeared into the forest, leaving her free to continue toward her final objective. Her pink gear hadn't just survived scrutiny, it had actively contributed to her concealment by exploiting cognitive biases that traditional camouflage couldn't touch. The past 18 days had validated every aspect of her unconventional survival philosophy. While her colleagues had been systematically tracked and captured using standard counter-surveillance techniques, Emma had moved through enemy territory like a ghost, completing objectives that required her to operate within miles of hostile forces without detection. Her success hadn't come from superior physical conditioning or advanced weapons training. It had emerged from a fundamentally different approach to survival that turned apparent vulnerabilities into strategic advantages. The pink gear that had drawn so much ridicule had proven to be her most effective tool for avoiding detection and maintaining operational freedom. The transformation had begun on day 2, when Emma encountered her first enemy checkpoint while attempting to reach a communication site. Traditional military thinking would have required her to wait for darkness and attempt a stealthy bypass that risked detection by thermal imaging and motion sensors. Instead, Emma had walked directly through the checkpoint in broad daylight, carrying her pink backpack and affecting the demeanor of a confused college student who had gotten lost while hiking. The guards had questioned her briefly before providing directions to the nearest trailhead, never suspecting that the helpless-looking young woman with the bright pink gear was actually an elite military operative on a classified mission. Her apparent vulnerability had triggered protective rather than suspicious responses, allowing her to gather intelligence about enemy positions and capabilities while appearing to be exactly what she claimed. That first success had established a pattern that Emma had exploited throughout the exercise. Her pink gear and carefully cultivated appearance allowed her to move through contested areas during daylight hours when traditionally equipped soldiers would have been forced to hide. She could approach enemy positions for reconnaissance by appearing to be a lost civilian seeking help, gather intelligence through seemingly innocent conversations, and disappear before anyone realized they had been compromised. The psychological principles underlying her strategy had proven more powerful than Emma had dared hope. Enemy forces operating under stress and time pressure relied heavily on rapid threat assessment protocols that categorized potential dangers based on visual cues and behavioral patterns. A small woman with bright pink gear didn't fit any of their threat templates, creating a blind spot that Emma could exploit repeatedly without raising suspicion. By day 5, when traditional participants were being captured at an accelerating rate, Emma had completed 3 of her 5 mission objectives while remaining completely undetected by enemy forces. Her success had prompted emergency modifications to the exercise parameters as observers struggled to understand how one participant could so thoroughly outperform expectations while using gear that appeared to violate every principle of military effectiveness. Colonel Hayes had visited the Exercise Control Center personally to review Emma's progress, studying tracking data that showed her moving freely through areas where other participants had been captured within hours. The pattern of movement suggested either extraordinary luck or the application of tactics that enemy forces weren't prepared to counter. "She's not following any recognizable evasion protocols," the exercise commander had reported during a briefing that Emma would learn about only after the exercise concluded. Standard tracking techniques that have captured every other participant are completely ineffective against her approach. It's like she's operating according to different rules entirely. The observation was more accurate than the commander realized. Emma was operating according to different rules principles, based on psychological warfare and strategic misdirection, rather than traditional concepts of concealment and stealth. Her pink gear wasn't just unusual equipment. It was the foundation of an entirely different survival philosophy that prioritized cognitive manipulation over physical hiding. As Emma approached her final objective on day 25, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The mockery and skepticism she had faced during equipment inspection seemed like ancient history, replaced by a growing awareness among military observers that they were witnessing something unprecedented in survival training. Her pink gear had performed flawlessly under conditions that had broken traditional equipment and conventional strategies. The bright colors that had drawn so much ridicule had proven to be perfectly adapted to the psychological dimensions of modern warfare, where perception and assumption often mattered more than technical capability. The final objective required Emma to penetrate a heavily defended command post and retrieve specific intelligence without being detected. Traditional approaches would have required night operations, specialized equipment, and extensive planning to avoid the multiple layers of security protecting the facility. Emma's approach was characteristically unconventional. She arrived at the command post during peak operational hours, carrying her pink backpack and affecting the nervous energy of a recent college graduate applying for an internship. Her story that she was a journalism student researching military training exercises for her thesis was received with helpful cooperation from guards who saw no threat in the earnest young woman with the quirky pink accessories, the intelligence she gathered during her interview with public affairs personnel exceeded the exercise requirements, providing detailed information about command structure, operational procedures, and security protocols that would have been impossible to obtain through traditional reconnaissance methods. Her apparent harmlessness had granted her access to sensitive areas and conversations that would have been strictly off-limits to anyone perceived as a potential threat. Emma's extraction from the command post was as smooth as her infiltration. She left with contact information for follow-up interviews and a standing invitation to return for additional research, having gathered more intelligence in 2 hours than other participants had collected during weeks of dangerous surveillance. Operations. The exercise concluded on day 30 with Emma's successful exfiltration to the designated rally point. She arrived carrying all her original equipment plus additional intelligence that exceeded every objective set for the exercise. Her pink gear showed signs of use but remained fully functional, having protected her through conditions that had destroyed traditional equipment carried by other participants. The debriefing that followed would become legendary within military survival training circles. Emma's success had been so complete and her methods so unprecedented that exercise observers struggled to categorize her performance within existing evaluation frameworks. She hadn't just survived, she had thrived in an environment designed to test the limits of military effectiveness. Colonel Hayes led the after-action review, her expression revealing new respect for approaches she had previously questioned. Lieutenant Chun's performance represents a paradigm shift in our understanding of survival operations, she announced to the assembled observers and participants. Her methods challenge fundamental assumptions about camouflage, concealment, and threat assessment. The audience included the soldiers who had mocked Emma's gear during equipment inspection, many of whom were still processing their early capture and the implications of her sustained success. Rodriguez sat in the front row, his earlier confidence replaced by thoughtful consideration of principles he had dismissed as impractical fantasy. The pink gear wasn't a gimmick, Emma explained during her presentation of lessons learned. It was a tool for exploiting psychological blind spots that traditional military training doesn't address. Enemy forces are trained to identify military threats, not to process contradictory information that challenges their threat assessment protocols. Her analysis included detailed documentation of encounters with enemy forces, psychological principles underlying her success, and recommendations for incorporating cognitive warfare techniques into standard survival training. The presentation revealed the depth of research and planning that had informed her unconventional approach, demonstrating that her success wasn't based on luck or accident. The impact of Emma's performance extended far beyond the exercise itself. Military survival schools began incorporating psychological warfare principles into their curricula, exploring how cognitive biases and perception management could enhance traditional evasion techniques. Her pink gear became the subject of serious academic study, with researchers analyzing how color choices and visual presentation could influence threat assessment and decision-making processes. Within 6 months, specialized equipment manufacturers were developing gear that incorporated Emma's principles while addressing practical considerations for field deployment. The bright colors that had once been dismissed as frivolous became recognized as sophisticated tools for psychological manipulation and strategic deception. Emma's career trajectory changed dramatically following her demonstration of unconventional survival techniques. She was assigned to develop new training programs that integrated psychological warfare principles with traditional military skills, working with elite units that required advanced evasion capabilities for specialized missions. The soldiers who had initially mocked her approach became some of her most dedicated students, recognizing that their assumptions about military effectiveness had been fundamentally flawed. Morrison requested assignment to her advanced survival course, acknowledging that his traditional training had left him vulnerable to detection methods that Emma's techniques could easily counter. Rodriguez approached Emma privately after the debrief, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine humility. "I owe you an apology," he said, extending his hand in a gesture of respect. "Your gear saved your life out there, and your methods could save all of ours." I was wrong to dismiss something I didn't understand. The apology represented more than personal acknowledgement. It symbolized a broader shift in military thinking about innovation and unconventional approaches. Emma's success had demonstrated that effectiveness could emerge from unexpected sources, challenging institutional biases that favored traditional over innovative solutions. Looking back on the exercise that had validated her theories, Emma recognized that the real victory hadn't been surviving 30 days in hostile territory. The real victory had been proving that questioning assumptions and thinking differently could produce results that traditional approaches couldn't match. Her pink gear had done more than protect her during the exercise. It had opened minds to possibilities that conventional wisdom had ignored. The bright colors that had once marked her as an outsider had become symbols of innovation and adaptive thinking that would influence military training for generations to come. The woman who had been mocked for her girly gear had become a pioneer, whose unconventional thinking changed how the military approached survival in an increasingly complex world. Her success proved that sometimes the most effective weapons were the ones that didn't look like weapons at all, and that true strength often came disguised as apparent weakness. Emma's pink backpack now sits in the Army's Survival Training Museum, a testament to the power of innovative thinking and the danger of underestimating those who dare to challenge conventional wisdom. Her story continues to inspire soldiers who face their own struggles with acceptance and innovation, proving that the most powerful victories often come from the most unexpected sources. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.